Hello, everyone. Welcome to the February edition of the ASP.NET Blazor Community Stand-Up. With us today, we have Stefan Halter.
Hi, nice to see you all again.
Jeremy Likness.
Good to be here.
John Galloway.
Process of elimination. It had to be me. Happy to be here.
And myself, Mackinnon. I'm a developer on the Blazor team. So today, the topic is modern Blazor Auth with OIDC. And so Stefan and Jeremy have some demos for us. But first, I think we're going to start off with the community links. So we'll go ahead and get my screen share up.
Yeah.
All right. So if this is your first time here, we do these community links as a way to showcase community activity around Blazor, whether that be like blog posts, videos, or community projects. So yeah, I picked some projects that I thought were pretty interesting and worth sharing. So let's go through those. The link is in the description of whatever platform you're on, I think. Okay, so the first one we have is a Blazor text editor called Simple Text Editor. And this one's really interesting because JavaScript interop is a feature in Blazor where you can have C# code that interfaces with the browser or with JavaScript via some APIs. But this is a text editor that has kind of like a rich text editing set of features, but it doesn't actually use any JS interop. So there's actually a sample site that shows this. And so you can type things out. And then you can like change the styling to like paragraph, header 2 or header 1. You can bold or italicize different parts of it. And then you can show like what the HTML and JSON output is. So I thought it was pretty interesting that someone could achieve this without doing any JS interop at all. So yeah, it's a really interesting project called Simple Text Editor.
Wow.
Yeah. So the next one we have is a blog post called Add Auth0 Authentication to Blazor Web Apps. And I was really impressed by this blog post because it goes incredibly in depth about like all the nuances you need to know about how like server-side rendering interacts with interactive render modes and how to persist the authentication state so that it works with both SSR and interactivity. And you should just be able to follow this tutorial and be able to add Auth0 authentication to your Blazor app. Or if you have like another custom auth provider, this generalizes pretty well beyond Auth0 as well. So yeah, really, really great in-depth blog post that is worth checking out if that's something you need to do for your Blazor web app. Okay, next we have another blog post about a library called fun.blazor, and this is like a F#. I think we've showed these a few times on these streams. Like there's a few different projects that provide an F# interface to Blazor, and this is one of those, and it showcases some uses of it, as well as it has some benchmarks. And it kind of shows that this one in particular, fun.blazor, favors pretty well when compared to some other benchmarks or even like C# code as well. So yeah, it's really interesting. They use F# computation expressions to construct the markup on the page rather than Razor syntax. So if you love F# and want to use it, this is a really interesting option. And yeah, they have a really nice docs page too that is written using fun.blazor, and it shows some examples of like how to use it. And so yeah, I thought this was pretty cool. Okay, next we have a project called Auralize Blazor. I think that's probably how you say it, but it's a audio visualizer component, and it lets you do these beautiful audio visualizations in real time using Blazor. I'll go to the demo page, but I'm going to mute the tab because it starts playing audio right away. So let's do that. And yeah, I just thought this was really cool. I think it wraps like a JavaScript library to help achieve some of this, but nevertheless, it's like pretty impressive, I think. Yeah, there we go. So you can't hear the audio because it's pretty loud, but they have a bunch of different sample visualizations. Sorry, what's that?
Just
I thought I heard something.
so cool.
Yeah.
Reminds me of like Winamp.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but there's a lot of different visualizations that are in this demo, and they're really cool looking. So, you know, if you want to build some kind of like audio player using Blazor. I think this could be a pretty cool source of inspiration.
It's so neat how many I don't know how many features have just been over the past years added into browsers that they can do this, you know, that they can handle all these AV things and processing and stuff.
Yeah, it's really amazing what browsers can do nowadays.
Wow.
Yeah, okay. So
there's a question on this. Danny Lai said, is source code available? So it's a GitHub project, right? So
oh, for the audio one, yeah, yeah, the GitHub page it should be in the link in the at least in the YouTube description. I'm not sure where it is on other platforms, but yeah, we have a URL list with all these projects, and I think they all have source code. So yeah, the source code is here in the RLA's Blazor repo. So cool. There we go. Next is another kind of graphics themed one. It's called Babylon Blazor, and it's a wrapper around Babylon JS. This is not like a complete wrapper, but it lets you at least use some of the Babylon JS API using Razor markup. I think there's an example somewhere on this page. Yeah, and this is kind of intended for like molecular visualization. So there's an actual demo site here. You can see this is like a 3D visualization set up using Blazor, and so you can view these different molecules and you know, analyze them in 3D. Can you zoom in? Oh, you can zoom in. Look at that.
That is cool.
Yeah.
You've got the whole AV show going today. Now I want to see this with the audio thing, and we've got a show.
Oh, that would be cool. I wonder, yeah.
Dancing molecules.
Oh, no, that would be cool. Yeah, combine the two.
IMAX.
Cool. All right, and then finally we have this project called Explain Face Rec, and this is a Blazor hybrid app. There's both a website and I think an iOS and Android app, or no, just Android. But yeah, it's a really interesting app that walks through how facial recognition works, and it's kind of set up in a tutorial-like format where you can upload your own images, and it does the facial recognition and has some like decent explanations as to how it's doing it. So so I thought this was really cool. The site is really clean, and it's available as an Android app as well. So so yeah, if you just want an example of a polished, you know, Blazor hybrid app, I think this is a good thing to look at. And also the app ID is just cool in general. It's like a nice educational project. So yeah, I think that's it for that one, and I think that concludes the community links. So I think we're ready for the demo.
All right. Let me just start presenting.
All right, he's logged in. Woo.
All right. So can everyone see the screen? Maybe? No? Yes? Okay. Oh, that I think they did with a inception, right? Okay, cool. So this demo that I'm going to talk about is probably pretty similar to that Okta blog post that Mackinnon just showed you, where it's integrating not with Okta, but with Microsoft Entra for Blazor authentication. And this is using what's known as the backend for front end, or BFF pattern for authentication. So to start off, I just wanted to quickly show you kind of the built-in option for the Blazor templates authentication. So if we were to create a new Blazor web app right here, you would notice, if we call this like in Auth, because that's what we're going to be doing here, that as far as authentication types in the template right now, we have individual accounts only. And then for render modes, we're going to choose like the most complicated, exciting option, which is auto, where it switches between server and WebAssembly. So this is basically a simpler version of what I'm going to show you, but I'm just going to create this first to show what's kind of the same and what's kind of different between these two options. So with the auto render mode, right, you get two projects. You get the client project and the server project. The client project includes components that can be both pre-rendered on the server and then rendered in WASM. So I think Steve Sanderson said during .NET Conf that we had considered calling the client project like maybe like everywhere project or what have you. So that's what we have going on there. So if we were to quickly set this as like the startup project, I'm not going to spend long here, but you'll see that this is your typical, we have entity framework. We're going to maintain our own identity database. We're going to have register, login links, email confirmation. So there's a certain amount of complexity to that. But what we have that might be different than previous versions of Blazor authentication is we have a custom authentication state provider, which is registered and defined inside the project itself. So if we go into Solution Explorer, this isn't some, decompiled code or, source link. This is something that is created with the template that is using persistent component state to basically take the authentication information from the server and then serialize that to the client. And then in the client, we have another authentication state provider. And instead of the persisting authentication state provider, we have the persistent authentication state provider. I know, easy to tell the difference, but this is basically the other, half of the same coin. So instead of, basically writing to persistent state with inside this register on persisting callback, it's writing your user ID and email and saying you are authenticated. It's then rehydrating claims principal based on this shared user info object. So
what's the error message I'm going to see when I mistype persistent and persisting? Because I know I'm going to do it.
So I'm pretty sure. So I mean, this is kind of interesting. So you can't do it wrong on the client project because you won't have a reference to the persisting one. On the server project, I haven't tried it. Do you guys want to take a diversion and see what happens if we then go and do the persistent? And then another thing is this is the revalidating authentication state provider because we have server inactivity. So when the WebSocket is staying open every 30 minutes, this is basically rechecking the user security stamp, which is a feature of our built-in identity provider. And so security stamp is basically something in the database that basically is randomly generated every time the user changes. So we can force people to log in again or something if they change their password. It's the common use case there. So this gets called on the revalidation interval. But yeah, if you did put the persistent authentication state provider there, that'd be fun because I do think, you'd probably need to get the right using, but I think it would compile. So
compile, ship it.
Yeah, maybe if we're feeling adventurous and we have more time at the end of this demo, we can go back to that just for fun. But in the meantime, I think that we do have a lot to cover in this back end for front end example where we're using OIDC, which is we're using in this case Microsoft Entra as an external identity provider, which I think is a better solution for a lot of applications. It's useful for single sign-on. You have a very robust management portal where you can assign different scopes to different users and things of that nature. Without further ado, I'm going to set this as our startup project. So the reason I'm using Aspire here, this isn't an Aspire demo, but because it's backend for front end, I'm also just going to delete these while I'll leave those there. Just remember the end off doesn't matter. So we really have two projects, right? So we have the Blazor project. I kind of consider that kind of a single thing. So we have the hosted for the server side rendering, and then we have the everywhere project for the things that can be client side rendered or server side rendered. But what I also am demonstrating here is a separately hosted backend API, which has a weather endpoint. Probably seen this kind of code before, very advanced, but it requires authorization and it requires the weather get scope. So this is using the backend for front end pattern, because being a kind of a web API, it's not meant to be hit directly by the browser. Instead of using cookies for auth, it's authenticating based on a bearer token. So we're doing add jot bearer, and in this demo, I'm using user secrets, as you all should. So I'm not exposing, my client secrets or anything to the stream. And I also don't risk accidentally checking it into source control when I'm pushing my docs updates to GitHub. But regardless, this is just using my personal MSDN subscriptions, so not a huge risk. And then what makes this kind of backend for front end is that when you do request the weather, you can either request it from client-side rendering or from server-side rendering. So when you're rendering on the server, we're going to be using the server weather forecaster. So this is kind of the simpler version, where we're talking directly to the backend. And the reason, so yeah, basically the way we get the bearer token is that we are pulling it out of an authentication cookie. So I thought we were doing, OIDC, right? So like, where do cookies come into play? So cookies are used for the authentication between the browser and like the Blazor front end. So this Blazor OIDC project. So a lot of you might have experience, calling builder.services.add authentication.add Microsoft, identity web or something like that, right? And what that's doing under the covers is making your life easier, as you'll see as I scroll down, but basically calling the code I'm calling right below here. But the reason I have this kind of more verbose code is kind of explain how this works, because I think this kind of hides a lot of detail, which can be helpful when debugging. So like, by all means, use Microsoft Identity Web if you're connecting to Entra, but this can work with other identity providers. And it kind of shows you how it all works. So what we have is when you call add OpenID connect, that is used to sign in, right? But it can't authenticate every request, because we're not going to redirect to Microsoft Entra to authenticate every single request. What happens is we have you log in once via an OIDC flow, and then we'll use the sign-in scheme to persist your user. And almost always the sign-in scheme is cookies. So if you were to F12 on that, and we had more information in the decompilation, cookies is the default value. Another thing that's important to make this backend for front-end pattern work is we're saving the tokens that are returned via the OIDC flow. So namely the access token and the refresh token inside the cookie for later usage. And then we're requesting that weather get scope that we were verifying we had in the backend. And the main thing that we want to configure here is the authority. You'll see a lot of these lines are commented out. So like, the client ID and so forth, mostly because I just didn't want to show it. But one thing to kind of note, not maybe everyone does, is like by default, the ASP.NET Core builder will, the web application create builder will read the authentication scheme name. See, this like basically maps to this here. So basically the OIDC options are read from authentication scheme name. So in the case of client ID, I just have the client ID defined using user secrets in that section of config. If you put it in your like app settings.json, in that, with that structure, it would work. And for certain things like client ID, that's probably fine, but I wouldn't do that for your client secret. But you always have the option to, of course, just manually configure all these things in the callback. We're going to use response type code instead of the implicit flow because we're not supporting every option. This is all we need, and this is kind of the most modern choice. By default, the OIDC handler will basically change your like sub claim and things like that in your name claim to very long URLs that were once used for SOAP. So I didn't want to really bother with that. And then these paths you would configure in the Azure AD or Entra portal. So these would both be redirect URIs that you configure, and this would be your remote sign out URI. And then you'll notice that I'm explicitly mapping the cookie authentication handler. So once I successfully sign in, there's a second authentication handler, which is used to, primarily here, that verifies every request. And that's where the server authentication comes in. So here, you'll notice that the access token is coming from HTTP context get token async. That is basically using the default authentication scheme and then reading that token. So I don't know. I see a little dot here, which scares me. So I'm going to hit Control-Z a couple times. Ooh, okay, I zoomed out a little bit. Sorry. I'm just going to use that. This is a little trackpad problems. Yeah, so that's the identity web change. So if we run this project, for all of you who haven't seen Aspire, you'll see the Aspire dashboard really quick. It's super useful, and we'll take a quick look at the dashboard as we log in to show what's going on here. So this is your basic Blazor template. I don't have any fancy, molecule or equalizer visualizations, but with this login button, I can show quickly kind of how that works. That's in the nav bar. So if we go to the layout and then go to like the nav menu, we have this like login or log out component, which, if you're authorized, gives you a login out link, and otherwise just, links to authentication login, which is the default URL for OIDC to start the login flow. So and then authentication logout is the default one for the logout flow. Notice that we have an anti-forgery token though for logout, just so some random malicious website, mybadwebsite.com can't force log you out of my website. So, might not be.
What
does
sure. Anti-forgery do? Like,
so back in the mean old days of the web, before people were as concerned about security, you could put a form tag on your page and basically post a request to any other website, and it would helpfully include all your authentication cookies. Right? So this is why it's important anytime you're taking a form post that you you read an anti-forgery token, because otherwise that could be triggered via malicious JavaScript, basically. Yeah, so the malicious site wouldn't be able to read the response, but like that doesn't really matter if they already like drained your bank account, or in this case, like logged you out, which is lower stakes, but still something we don't want to allow. So yeah, so we can take a quick look. We can look at the network tab to see what's going on here a little. Log in. And if I had been logging in the first time, it would ask me like, hey, do I really want to allow this website to like read, my email address and so forth, right? But Entra remembers that I said yes to that before when I was preparing this demo, and then I just took out my phone to do this little approval. And then there we go. That's my name, right? Stefan Halter. So you can see we, had that whole sign-in. Microsoft was our redirect back that I specified earlier. I didn't preserve logs, so you can't see all of the requests, but there's some requests you haven't seen. Okay, this doesn't show anything sensitive for what it's worth at the moment. But in here, right, if we look at the traces, this will show the requests that our Blazor front end actually made to log in. So if we look at this login request, we can view it, and we see this chain. So like log in Microsoft online, and then it redirects back, and we get our authentication code. At that point, we could make a request for the ID token, but we're not using that in the sample. But that's like another option we have. So the question is, all right, we have this, server weather forecaster, and that works well when you pre-render on the server. But how are we, dealing with the same thing when we're rendering the weather forecast in WASM? So in the client project, we define this iWeather forecaster interface. So this same component, in this case, we have the weather page that consumes it, the iWeather forecast, can run on both the server and the client. So far, so it's pretty simple. It just reads forecasts, calling that API. You saw the server weather forecaster that reads the access token out of the cookie from the HTTP context. And that's how that pre-renders on the server. But when you're rendering in WASM, we have to do something different because we don't have an HTTP context, nor do we have the access token. The access token that we retrieved, while it's stored encrypted in the cookie, is designed for server-rendered web apps. And that actually removes some restrictions that you have with Entra. So if you're doing a SPA, where you're getting a Entra access token directly in the browser. So say you're doing like a WASM only app, that's common using MSAL. Then in that case, you can only stay logged in at 24 hours at a time before you're forced to log in again. And this is a security measure because access tokens stored in the browser are more vulnerable to cross-site scripting attacks. In this case, we're never providing the access token to the client. So it's more secure, which is nice, which means we shouldn't have to log in again for at least 30 days. But that does mean that we can't make a direct request to that minimal backend that I was showing you earlier with this weather forecast, because this is using bearer auth, and it's expecting a token, not a cookie. So for the front end, what we have is we have another implementation of the weather forecaster that doesn't depend on the HTTP context. What it's doing is it's just making a plain Jane like request to weather forecast on our front end server project. So you can see, okay, so where is weather forecast defined and how does that work? So what I did is this uses YARP, right? Which is, you can find that at Microsoft Reverse Proxy. So if we look at here, we have Map Forwarder, which is an API defined by YARP, yet another reverse proxy, that is then using the Aspire service name resolution magic to find the weather API based on the domain name. And then it's adding a request transform. So for every request to weather forecast, it forwards that request to the weather API, and before doing so, it extracts that same access token that we were extracting earlier, and then just puts that in the authorization header. And since we're now on the server, we have the data protection APIs. We can decrypt the cookie. We can use the access token, which we got only because we called save tokens above here, and then forwards that request. So, and then that's pretty much all you need. So, the reason you have to do it that way is, you don't have like an HTTP context here. So this is just relying on the cookie that is generally available when you're using HTTP client on the WASM side of things. So
Stefan, we've had a few questions in chat, and I just wanted to ask really quickly. One of the common ones is asking just about a template that does Entra. So we've got a sample that shows connecting to Entra using OIDC that you're going through. But is it true that basically, so our individual auth template will basically provide all of the mechanisms for persisting the authentication state? It's just set up to wire locally. And so what you're doing in this sample is actually showing the OIDC flow and showing using those components to persist the auth state between the client and the server with that kind of handshake, right? So is that a valid?
Yes. And I think that's, we've been working out in the open since, early December on this. So, the mechanisms we use for persisting authentication state and stuff, we originally developed for individual auth, but we're reusing the exact same principles for the OIDC auth. That being said, we do plan to make this easier, and in .NET 9, I think you can expect to have organizational auth in the template. But if you're not starting from our documentation example that we're working on, which we can provide links later, like right now, if I were to click on this, you can see that there's an open PR, which goes, exactly into this scenario. So we have the Blazor app with OIDC, and hopefully this will be merged soon. You can view and download the sample code, and it's going over this project that I'm showing you right now. So
okay,
yeah,
and I'll get
progress.
the PR and post it into chat for everyone. And the only other thing I wanted to cover too is there are some questions about cookies and persistence and backend for front end. And so to clarify, the backend for front end, what it's doing is it's handling some of the auth handshakes on the server instead of the client. So the client doesn't have to worry about storing secrets that could be exposed. Is that a good summary?
I think that's a great summary. Yeah, exactly. And then the complication that adds is that the client can't make direct requests to the bearer the services that require that bearer token, which is why we showed that proxy step.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. And another thing. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, that's it.
Okay. Yeah. And yeah, another thing to note is part of the reason this authentication state provider is in the template for now, and in this sample instead of something that's built in. We do plan to address that, but right now it gives you a place inside your project to decide exactly which claims to serialize to the client project. So in this sample, we're only serializing 2 claims: the user ID or the sub, and the name. If you have any other claims that you want to persist to the client, you can just add some new properties here. You could do public const string scope or something, right? And then you can serialize that as well. But that's a choice that you have to make, and then you should of course update from claims principal and to claims principal, so that information is available inside the client project. Right now in the client project, we basically only care if you are authenticated or not. So we're just using a plain authorized attribute. So and we use the name. for the nav bar rendering. So you can say, if we're looking at the page, log out stuff in Halter, right? So that's being read from the claims principal, both on the server and the client. But if you wanted like any other information to render your page in WASM, you would include it in your user info that then gets serialized to a claims principal. And we just want to be careful because historically, the claims that you would get when doing an OIDC flow would stay on the server. So we didn't want to go and serialize everything to the client because it's not clear to us as framework developers whether the client should be able to view all their claims. And in most cases, we think it's probably fine, but we'll leave that decision to you for now. So another thing that's kind of interesting about this demo is that it enables token refresh. So to this point, the common way that we would tell people to basically refresh their token. So like let's happens when your access token expires, right? The problem is that if the cookie hasn't expired, like, you'll be authenticated on the front end, but then your request to this, back end, whether endpoint's going to fail with an expired bearer token. So one easy way to fix that is to go into the server project, and you can go, into your OIDC options, and then do use token lifetime. And what this will do is it will set the cookie lifetime to match the expiration of the token. So at least you'll be logged out when your token expires, at least the next time you refresh the page or whatever. And that's good. But this sample goes a little bit of a step further. And by the way, like if you're doing Microsoft Identity Web, they handle refresh automatically already, but this works generically for most any OIDC provider. I define this configure cookie OIDC refresh, and then this takes the name of the two authentication schemes. So first it takes the name of the cookie authentication scheme, and then it takes the OIDC authentication scheme name. And what it's doing is it's hooking the on-validate principal event on the cookie authentication scheme. So basically every single time that, every request that you send with a cookie, it's going to call this validate or refresh cookie async, which is defined inside this cookie OIDC refresher. And if we take a quick look at that, what it's doing is it's pulling that, the expires that token, which will tell us when the access token expires. And if it's expired, it will then make a request to get a refresh token. So to quickly demonstrate this, because this token isn't going to expire for another 30 days, we'll just use the debugger. So I'll hit this weather endpoint. Every time you make a request with the cookie, right, it's hitting this callback. And I'll say that the access token expiration is now. And when I do, we should hopefully get all the way down here and be able to store those tokens and refresh our cookie. I did it once, so it should be fine. Yeah, there we go. So, I'm not going to like hover over my access token stuff, but you can see like I got, the new bearer token type and a new expires ad. And yeah. So now every time that you're within 5 minutes or whatever, and we can adjust that and make that configurable. This is something we would like to build into .NET 9, but for now, it's not like a huge amount of code. I think it's like 100 lines. This is also in that sample we're working on. So you should be able to, stay logged in indefinitely as long as, you're actively using the the app, the refresh token lasts a good amount of time. So like even if the access token is expired for what it's worth, like the refresh token should still be good. So it's not like you just have a 5-minute window here. But anyway, so that is kind of the main stuff that I wanted to go over on this. Are there any further questions?
Let me see. We have had questions come in. You answered kind of a class of them. I mean, yeah. So we shared the PR.
Yeah, if it would be helpful while we're looking for some questions, I just wanted to address. I know one of the most common requests that we're getting from developers is the Entra example with the Blazor web app. So the template has the built-in individual, which shows how to persist the authorization state when you get it, but it uses the local. And then we have a sample with Entra. I work with the Entra team. We actually have a weekly sync, and they are working on a sample that uses the Entra library with a Blazor web app. So those samples will come out, and then eventually the goal is to set that organizational option back in the templates. And so that is something we're targeting to do this release cycle, if you will. But we are aware that people are struggling a little bit with Entra and Blazor, and we're hoping these samples will give you kind of a stopgap until we can build something in. But just wanted to give some of that context. And to answer the question, which variant, we will give a solution like the one that Stefan's going through that handle. Oh, I'm sorry, this one's locked into, but the template for individual auth handles all of the variants of interactivity and rendering modes, and we would strive to do the same thing.
Did you cover, like, so I know it's early in the release. By the way, while this has been started, we just put out the blog post about .NET 9 Preview 1 going out. Do we have like a more to say on the roadmap or thoughts, like big picture? Like you've mentioned a few things we're interested in doing. Is there like a big...
Yeah, so I'll let Stefan talk to some of the things he may or may not be able to commit to. I know from the Entra side, I'm working with that team, so they're on a different release cycle. So what we would do is once they have their samples the way they want them, then we would work with the tools team to look at templating and scaffolding and the other mechanisms that you can get it into the product. So I don't have a firm like a preview target for that, but as I work with that team and we get farther along with the samples, we'll be able to share publicly some more around when we think those would come out. But Stefan has been working hard in creating as many samples as he can so that there's a kind of stopgap that people can refer to in the interim. And then we do have some work that's coming up for .NET 9, but not all of it's specific to Entra to answer that. I don't know, Stefan, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, so I also working with the Entra team, and one of the top items is to create a version of this OIDC sample with Entra. I like this community stand-up because it lets you go into a deep dive and stuff. So I think in some ways the add Microsoft Identity Web almost makes things too easy. You don't realize what's going on, which is great when it works. It's wonderful when it works. And honestly, I think you should use the libraries that are provided by your identity provider if they provide them, right? Because there's so many little nuances, right? You saw like how many little things I had to configure. Entra does OIDC, right? But there are various ways that you might want to customize it to work well by setting like a non-default response type and so forth, maybe changing how you map inbound claims and so forth. So it's not super difficult. Like a lot of this is just comments because I'm trying to be very clear for documentation purposes. But yeah, like we're working on the Entra samples, and yeah, I recommend using their library. But this kind of shows you how the authentication schemes tie together. And hopefully, if you get some kind of error about like, oh, we weren't able to find your sign-in scheme, for example, right? Like you now know that what that is, right? It's like you need a cookie authentication scheme most likely. If you really wanted to, you could try to combine it with the new bearer token kind of handler that we use for map identity API. But that would be odd to do. I honestly haven't seen OIDC handler used with any others handler other than cookies. It just makes sense.
Okay. I have a silly random question that probably doesn't even make sense, but I'll ask it anyways, because that's part of the value I add. I was listening to a podcast this morning about how passkeys are kind of getting everywhere. Does this relate to passkeys at all?
That's silly. That's random. And no, okay.
What a terrible question. No, that I've been hearing a lot about that as well. And it seems to be super convenient. We're keeping an eye on it. It does seem to be something that the OIDC providers themselves support as well. So you can opt, like, if you have, Azure AD, you can, I think they have options for that. Don't quote me, but.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Like a provider level thing, right? And so as long as you're handling it in your app and relying on a provider, then they can.
Right, and that's not to say we couldn't do anything, right? Like in theory, we could, add support to that for our, individual auth, our EF-based identity store stuff. But we haven't committed to that. But it's definitely something we're keeping an eye on.
Okay. And then another question, and I apologize if you covered because I've been bouncing back and forth between things. What's the best way for people to make requests or have input or kind of follow along with what you're working on as things progress for .NET 9? And
well, the community stand-up's a good start, and we'll keep on trying to put out like developer-oriented content. GitHub is great, right? Like we're always triaging GitHub. Like if you have a feature suggestion or an API idea or what have you, feel free to open an issue. And if we end up like, marking as a dupe or whatever, a duplicate issue, certainly don't feel bad. Like it's still a very good signal for us, to see, how many people want us to work on a given feature in a given area.
Okay. I am tempted. Yeah, I'm going to low-key hijack just a second because I want to show something off that I think will relate to that. So I'm going over to this window, going over to that window. So we just announced this. This is our, if I bring up my screen. So we're moving to using GitHub discussions more. So we just put this one out this morning for .NET 9 Preview 1. So we will have some blog posts during this release, but we're really kind of like pushing it so that it's more united with the GitHub discussions and issues and all that kind of stuff. So, so here's our kind of welcome thing about the GitHub discussions, and then you're going to see all the previews and the interaction and stuff moving over into GitHub discussions more. So, anyways, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on anything, but this should hopefully make it easier to follow what we're building and where the roadmaps are and all the ways to get involved. So, all right. Did we have more questions? I'm not sure if any other questions jumped out that we didn't already highlight or cover enough.
It was just too simple, right? Like too easy. So
I'm going to reread those comments. I love the way that you commented the code and explained stuff. I wish I saw more samples like that. So let me see.
Yeah, and that's also to like kind of help out, our excellent doc writers as well, who are working on those PRs. So I want to make sure they could like follow along with my reasoning for setting each property the way I did.
Yeah, I like too that you showed off the Aspire dashboard in there. And so I guess another question I got for you is just when you get something wrong, what are your steps for troubleshooting if something's wrong? Like, what do you recommend for a developer that's newer to this to, can't get something to work, or,
I mean, the first Hail Mary is if I see an error message I haven't seen before, I'll Google it and hope, or Bing it, or ChatGPT or Copilot or what have you. But I'll ask the interwebs what's going on, and that can often be helpful. But the other thing is, like, especially with the Aspire dashboard, like taking a look at those network traces can be helpful. It's I don't want to tell other people to like read OIDC specs, because that's for people like me to do. So hopefully the error messages are helpful enough. And if not, file an issue, right? Like, that's actually a developer experience thing that we care a lot about. So if a real common one is like invalid issuer. So that can sometimes just be fixed by it's annoying, right, when it's just like a configuration value that's wrong, which is often kind of the case there, where it's like it should have been one URL and not the other. And oftentimes that's where searching the internet will help you find people with similar issues.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to add for the people who are really new to Auth and need more background and understanding. One of the commitments we made for .NET 8 that we're still working on is what I call a navigator document, which is basically like, where do you want to start? Like, I don't know anything about Auth, or I know about Auth, but how does it work with Blazor web app, or how do I hook to Entra? So we're compiling some of the paths, because we know we have a lot of great examples and documentation out there that's sometimes just hard to find. So the idea of this doc is like a choose your own adventure, kind of where are you at, what are you using, and land you on the right document. So it's taken a little bit longer than expected, but look for that document to come, and I think it'll be very helpful for people who are trying to find very specific information about Auth.
Yeah, and like, just kind of as a general guideline too, is if you're running into errors that don't have like a stack trace in the exception that like points to your code, which unfortunately in Auth is like pretty much all of them, is like look at the how to increase like the logging verbosity sometimes. That will and then look at the logging output for those error messages if you can.
Cool. Gosh, that's a great demo. I'm gonna watch and run that code and read through those comments some more. I don't know, Mackinnon, or any other things we should cover as we're wrapping up?
I think that's about it. We do have some questions, comments, if we think we have time to cover like a couple.
I know Jeremy has a hard stop, but I'm here for you guys.
Okay. So Stefan, we've got them starred over in the right side. I don't know if you click on starred in there, if you'll see them.
Give me a second. All right. Yeah. All right.
Those are some we think are good.
Okay. So why no minimal API? I think we showed some. Can you add an option to disable user registration? You'd like to use it, but we don't need user registration. So yeah, this I think is for the individual auth option, which we showed, right? Because if you're using an identity provider that like depends, like I'm sure there's a way in the Entra portal to do that. But as far as with the identity auth, like for Blazor with the latest template, we put the registration page like in your project, right? So if you delete register.razor, then I don't see how anyone would ever be able to register. So maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but like and also like depending on how you set up your Azure Entra, like you can support like either public accounts, kind of domain accounts, both. And so if you want to limit users, like put everyone in your domain, right, manually, and limit it to domain accounts. Someone said they don't like having weather forecasts in so many places to make this process work. I kind of agree with that. I will say that with that map forwarder, you can put wildcards there. So in like this example, there was only one endpoint. But if you were proxying like that entire backend, like you can just use wildcards. And if you have questions on how to do that, feel free to ask using discussions or what have you. And then not using Stack Overflow anymore. No, definitely Stack Overflow. I like Stack Overflow. I should have recommended that. Is there for expanding into identity server functionality eventually? So there, it's almost a Jeremy question, but I know the answer. And the answer is there are no plans currently for doing identity server functionality. There are open source solutions out there. I understand that like not everyone wants to use like Duende identity server, but that can be a good option, especially for smaller businesses. There's also like Keycloak. There's of course also Entra. But at the time, we are somewhat limited in resources on ASP.NET, and that's not a focus right now, is providing like a self-hosted identity server.
Yeah, I think that's important because there's two sides to that. There's an identity server, and then there's the branded identity server, right? So we've got a great relationship with Duende. They're doing a lot with identity server. It's still a great option for those that it makes sense for. On our end, as far as standing up an identity server, right now we've got the self-host solution for smaller projects, and then you graduate to something bigger that could be Entra is our solution, but then there's Auth0, there's identity server. So there's lots of options out there. So it's tough to make a good argument for building yet another one, if that makes sense. So
yeah, B2C is also great. That allows you to have multiple. You can sign in with Google or have a custom sign and all that. And have I been pronouncing it wrong the whole time? I've been in meetings with this team so many times. So it's Entra. I keep on saying Entra. All right, Entra. I'll remember that.
Well, no, I corrected myself. I was saying Entra, then I thought it was Entra. So who knows? We'll solve this mystery.
But it's like Azure versus Azure, right? Everyone knows it's Azure, clearly.
Well, I think that was pretty good coverage. Jeremy had to drop off, and I've got to run too. So that was awesome. We definitely got to get you back on. Everyone loved your demo, so you're welcome back.
Thanks. All right, I'm glad.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Here's the button to say goodbye. All right.
All right.